From our world headquarters in New York, Bloomberg surveillance futures -5, Dow futures at -44, 10-year yield 3.39%. He is in Washington. Strategas Research Partners, Dan Clifton. Dan, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on this morning.
What's changed in the last 2 weeks? The politicians are home. They're getting the pulse. What's the nuance at the margin here of the last 2 weeks?
I would say that on August 6th, we were close to having a bipartisan agreement in the Senate Finance Committee on a big healthcare piece, on the healthcare legislation. And I think those dynamics have changed significantly with members of Congress coming back. There has been such severe pushback on this idea of doing an $800 billion to $1 trillion health care program, as well as a $1.5 trillion deficit and all the other issues that are going on. And I think that's starting to change members of Congress' behavior, much to the error of the current congressional leadership.
Well, you know, according to the polls, a lot of the opposition comes from older Americans who figure that the only way to control health care costs is to start some kind of rationing, and it's their health care that's going to be rationed.
Well, I think that the poll numbers show that it's down across the board. But you're right that it's disproportionately the seniors that are falling the most. One of those reasons is they're going to cut Medicare Advantage. So you hear President Obama say, if you like your health care, you can keep your health care. But in fact, if you have a Medicare Advantage plan, you're going to lose that Medicare Advantage plan. So there is some anxiety among seniors, and I think it's going to be very hard to bring them back into the fold. But if you look, the independent voters, which were the base of the Democratic Party in the 2006 and 2008 election to ensure that they can win, are starting to leave the party. The rank and file Democrat members are getting that. I'm not really sure that the Nancy Pelosi and the leadership of the Democratic Party understand that health care has become a liability, not a positive for them.
Well, Dan, does this tell us more about just health care reform as an issue, or does it really tell us more about how the administration's been trying to sell it?
Well, yeah, I think it's a combination of both. You know, I came on when they started changing their message about the health insurance reform. But really, you know, policy in Washington, D.C. happens on an incremental basis, step by step. Very rarely do large pieces of legislation pass. Yes, it's the president's first year. Yes, his political capital was the highest, so you try it. And I think that the president sitting at 50% in the Gallup poll shows that they used up all that political capital. We are now faced with a choice, and that choice is, are members of Congress going to choose accomplishment, get something done, maybe get 20 million, 30 million Americans insured, or are they going to choose ambition and still try this government-run health insurance? That decision will be made that next week, and I think that's the critical decision to be watching for.
Dan, you've got a page here with 3 charts on it. Neil, the camera guy, get in here. 1, 2, 3 charts here. Debt held by the public, the budget deficit with a right-angle hockey stick move. But you've got a distressing chart of tax receipts. Neil, I don't know if you can see it here, but this little loop-de-loop curled down here. I mean, the decline in tax receipts is a lot worse than the 2001 recession, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And when we look at tax revenues, this is probably going to be the worst year on record for tax revenues. We've lost 6 million jobs. Tax revenues are tied to the people working, and it's going to be very hard for those tax revenues to come back. Now, the positive side of that, Tom, is that tax revenues as a percentage of GDP, or whichever way you want to measure it, is probably going to be the lowest on record. It is below 15% of GDP, and that's working to help keep disposable income higher. But at the same time, you cannot be spending at 26% of GDP when your revenues are at 15%.
Am I correct within the Strategas Research view that you're essentially shifting the worst of the deficit into next year? We've been looking at 1.8 trillion or whatever, and then a lower number next year. You're saying no?
Well, Tom, I think that what was happening here is that investors believe that we were going to get an orderly decline in deficit, that 09 was the peak year. And the Strategas view is that the deficit is going to stay higher, is going to stay around longer, and at a higher level than most people expect in the 1.5 to 1.6 range. For the exact reason you just referenced, tax revenues lag economic activity by 1 year. We could be growing at 3.5% of GDP right now, but it's going to take the job creation and the nudging of that unemployment rate before tax revenues come back, and it's probably a 9-month to 1 year story.
Well, speaking of taxes, Dan, The Hill this morning is reporting the nation's biggest labor union, the AFL-CIO, and some allied Democrats are pushing a new tax that would hit big investment firms like Goldman Sachs. They're proposing about 0.1% on every stock transaction, which, of course, would hit a company like Goldman Sachs because they make so many transactions. Wall Street, of course, not an especially popular place right now. Is this going to happen, or is this just sort of one of these trial balloons that gets floated?
Well, I think that this started as a trial balloon, and it started as a way to generate revenue among the left and kind of beat up on Wall Street. But I think it's starting to gain a lot more momentum amongst groups. Why? Because we have about $250 billion that we spent on infrastructure. That needs to be reauthorized this year. We don't have any money for it. There's just this classic, beat up populism on anything of Wall Street. But I think a lot of that populism is starting to lose its steam with the voters itself. The voters want to know when the unemployment rate's going to go down, and this bashing of bank CEOs is not as effective as it was 9 months ago. And I really don't believe a tax like that would be able to go somewhere, but it is building legs and starting to become a little bit more mainstream than it was at the beginning of the year.
Dan, just in the minute we've got left here, and
Sure.
we'll have you back here in a bit. When we look at all this and we sum it all up, what will be the mood when the politicians come back that Tuesday or Wednesday after Labor Day?
Well, it's one of anxiety. I mean, the Democratic members that we're talking to are coming back, and they are demanding that their leadership moderate themselves down. So you're going to see a lot of inter-party fighting tension as they come back. The Republicans, for the first time in 5 years, feel emboldened, and they're going to be very bombastic, but they got to be careful not to overplay their hand. They are promising that they are going to fight them hard. The Democratic members, the rank-and-file members, are saying that they are going to ask their leadership to moderate down their proposals, and I think that's going to set up interesting TV for the month of September.
Dan Clifton, stay with us, please. We'll have you back here. We continue with Dan Clifton at our Washington News Bureau with Strategas Research Partners. Dan, I don't know if you've seen it, New York Times today, Chairman Baer of the FDIC, we can't put all our eggs in one basket. Give us a stock report on Sheila Baer. How's she doing as we come back from Labor Day?
Well, I think what's interesting here is there's a lot of focus on health care, but financial regulation is front and center. The administration continues to send up pieces of legislation on all the components. And what I find interesting is how strongly worded Sheila Baer is this morning against her own boss, and that's President Obama's proposal.
Are you long or short Sheila Baer?
Well, I think that she's untouchable, because if they did try and fire her right now, it would look like it wouldn't be good. She's established herself inside the establishment as a fighter against the status quo. The key point that she's making this morning is that she is not the person for groupthink, and that she needs to be independent. And if you have one regulator, it gets too concentrated with groupthink. So she's really established herself.
Right.
I would be short her after the 2010 election, but I don't think anything's going to happen to her until then.
Is there a political angle here? Is she more like GOP or more Democrat?
Well, look, she was part of a Republican administration, but she's about Sheila Baer, not partisan politics. And she truly believes that she's doing the right thing, and that she was right on the collapse, that she saw it coming, and nobody paid attention to her. And that's made her much more independent, and I think it transcends party.
Is she, just quickly here in 30 seconds, Dan, sure. Is she less independent because of the rapidly increasing set of bank failures?
Well, I don't know if she's less independent. I think she's much more hamstrung. She's got a fund that is depleting. There's only $10 billion left. The ratio to the amount of reserves is at its lowest level, way below where it should be. And I think that's going to hamstring her. The only way out of this for her is to talk about raising taxes on banks or raising fees on banks that should be getting help or we're trying to help get through this crisis. So I think that she's going to go through a very tumultuous period over the next year.
Dan Clifton, thanks so much for your perspective with Strategas Research